Get off that exhausting hamster wheel and into balanced living with Dr. Marissa.
Promise you joy in the mystery.
Dr. Marissa, also known as the Asian Oprah. Her mission, to be a beneficial presence on the planet. Her purpose, to be your personal advocate to live, laugh, love, learn. Her life motto, don't die wondering. Take back your life with Dr. Marissa Pei.
And welcome. You're tuned into Take My Advice. I'm not using it. Get balanced with Dr. Marissa, the morning show here on KCAA, NBC News, CNBC News, and NBC Sports Radio Station, AM 1050, FM 106.5, and streaming everywhere. iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, TuneIn, Audible, Amazon Music, Tiki Live, Rumble, Podchaser, Spreaker, Streaker, and more. I am Dr. Marissa, your hashtag positively opinionated host on this show, podcast show number 1206, but who's counting, and 641 consecutive weeks. And this is a show about hope and happiness. So there's no gossip, no scandal, no K words, no Kanye talk, formerly or now. Instead, I want you to focus on your own reality show and how you can be happy 88% of the time. So I have topics and guests to that end, and it is Monday. So you know that is the sign for hashtag Mental Health Matters Mondays. And today I have a very special guest. His name is Michael Luongo. He's an award-winning journalist, TEDx speaker, and academic who's the author and editor of 16 books, most focused on travel, LGBT issues, and a novel. He's a PhD student and instructor at Purdue University, where he researches tourism redevelopment in the context of conflict, focusing on Iraq, Rwanda, and Ukraine. And he also teaches writing online for UCLA. That's where we met. Yes. He has been to over 100 countries and all 7 continents, including his freelance reporting in the New York Times, Bloomberg News, CNN, Gay City News, and other publications. Please welcome to my studio, Michael Luongo.
We also met through our mutual teaching for UCLA. So it's a way to bring people together. So
and I don't believe everything in my life is accidental, which is not accidental. Yes. So we were required. Well, I don't know if it was required, but we were in this prepping your class. It's been some years. I don't know if you know my teaching history. I'm actually a retired professor, and I came out of retirement to teach this class, and I'm happy to do it in the fall. If you all want to take Michael's class, which is...
So I teach personal essay. I'm teaching over the summer. I'm not sure whether I'm teaching...
usually
in the summer that I teach, but that class is great for my UCLA classes, my Purdue classes, different places that I teach at. So
awesome. Yeah. And I'm teaching leadership, success, and happiness in the fall. So if you are interested in that, I know we're streaming live on LinkedIn as well. Lots of business people there. You're welcome to take our classes, because life is way too short to stop learning. And I start every show, and I didn't warn you about this because I don't want it to be planned. But it's breakfast with myself and my guests. So I take a bite of my gratitude sandwich. So it's a good life habit, starting the day. Those of you who start your day with me every weekday morning, the top of the bun is things that you are grateful for outside of yourself. And the bottom of the bun are things that you are grateful for inside of yourself. And that's like a model for us before we go to bed tonight, instead of thinking about all the things that didn't go right, or what we forgot to do, or who done me wrong. Instead, we're thinking about, what do we like about ourselves? So let's start with the top of the bun. What am I grateful for? I'll kick it off. I am so grateful for a fabulous birthday weekend where I got to go to the Long Beach Jazz Festival, and my sister Keiko Matsui played an amazing set. And then she was brought on stage by her friend Kurt Whalen, who was there after, who was amazing. Lots of amazing artists, and I'll be playing some clips. And it certainly was a great way to celebrate my birthday. What are you grateful for?
Oh, well, anyway, happy birthday week.
Thank you.
Of course, Saturday was on your birthday, actually. And you were,
I know, I worked.
And, not the usual way in which somebody has a Saturday class. I remember this sort of, golden gown, kind of like, at least what I could see through the camera. I think, I'm grateful in many ways for being as old as and experienced, I guess, is that internal, living a good life, I think I would say. I'm, in New York. I'm privileged to be a PhD student as well. That's in Indiana. So living in two parts of the country simultaneously, I think that's, something to be very grateful for, to be able to do that and have those experiences. So maybe that's the top bun, I guess I would say.
It's all good. It's all good. I am grateful that I was taking a little B-roll when I was at Rosie's Beach in Long Beach, and I saw the setup for the torch passing that was going to happen later on that day. And I had heard that it was a Snoop Dogg production and Billie Eilish was going to, so I was panning just before I got in my car, panning. And all of a sudden, is that Snoop Dogg? So I actually got, so like in the only place where there was no covering, when he had to go from one tent to the other side, there's Snoop Dogg, and another accidental kind of cool thing.
Wow.
All right.
That is great. Wow.
Isn't that cool? He's tall. I had no idea that he was that tall.
And I guess he was back from Paris then, because wasn't he?
Yes.
Didn't he
was
help
right.
in the Olympics? Yeah.
I just saw him open the break dance event. We'll call it that. And then all of a sudden he's in Long Beach. So I kind of like that.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And one more gratitude from you.
More gratitude. I think, again, having family, having friends, people I can rely on.
Name one in particular.
I'm actually grateful that tomorrow I'm flying to Purdue, and it is a new semester of teaching, more dedicated work on my dissertation. And I'm actually liking the idea of back to school. I even bought socks, the things you hated as a kid, like having to buy for back to school. So that's one other thing I'm grateful for, that back to school. I know.
There you go. There you go. All right, bottom of the bottom. What do you like about yourself? The reason why I do this is a lot of us are, we grow up in homes or cultures or countries where, you're not all that, don't toot your own horn. In my culture, Chinese and Japanese, there's this saying that if the nail stands up, hammer down, right? Yeah, exactly. You would know that from your cultural experience. And so the downside of that is we are constantly with antenna looking around for approval or likes. Who likes me? Literally with social media. So this is the part where I ask people to exercise their ability to approve of themselves. So what do you like about yourself? And we'll just do one each so we can jump into the topic for the day. I appreciate my ability to transcend my cultural norms. And I'll never forget the moment when the astrologer said to me, "You're a Leo in 6 planets. You can't help yourself but be in front on camera talking." And that shame of the Chinese woman, don't be on stage. And that was an extreme, beautiful, wonderful moment of my life. So what do you like about yourself?
I think one thing and again, it's part of teaching, the nurturing aspect, being empathetic, understanding other people's situations. Part of this is, part of it I've developed in going to many cultures, many countries. I think it was always inside of me in many ways because of my experiences as a child. But I would say my ability to be empathetic and understand other people's situations would be one of the characteristics I like most about myself.
Beautiful. Great. And thank you so much. Oh, somebody got a finger there. Not that finger, but we got one of these. And I love it when we have an active cashew gallery. We've got Robert Stein in there. Thank you for joining us. And I got a happy birthday. Thank you. I'm a Leo, so I'll be celebrating all month. So thank you for that. And so glad that you're here. And please do ask any questions or make comments all throughout this live broadcast. And that's it for Breakfast with Dr. Marissa and her guest, Michael Luongo, here on Take My Advice, I'm Not Using It. Get Balanced with Dr. Marissa, the morning show. # Mental Health Matters Mondays. I promise you, if you complete and continue that good life habit for the next consecutive 28 days, you will build a good habit on sandwiching your day in the most positive way. And for those of you who just joined us, you know that this show is not going to talk about anything that any other show is talking about right now, because I do not talk about CNN constantly negative news. You can get that everywhere. In fact, everybody's talking about the same thing right now except us. So thank you for all those who said wouldn't last a year, a show that is about hope and happiness. We're on 12 and a half years. So love you too. No. So today, it's an interesting angle. And I've never really thought about this whole area that Michael specializes in. So I thought it would be really interesting to have him on to talk about tourism, travel after trauma for countries. And I'm just going to let you take this away by answering my favorite question, which is, I don't have an answering machine, Michael. I have a questioning machine. And when you call me, it says, who are you? And what do you want? Okay. So go ahead.
So I think, part of this interview and this time on your show, and again, thank you for having me on here, was you watched my TEDx, the TEDx that I had done at Purdue last year, where I talked about, why I do the things that I do, why I do the research I do. And a lot of it came out of my experiences in Ground Zero. A few days after September 11th, I went in with my then brother-in-law. I was part of, some call it a cleanup crew, some call it a rescue crew, some call it a recovery crew. But this idea of, as somebody who was a travel journalist and writer, photographer, to suddenly be in that environment where I very directly experienced what it was like to be in a conflict zone. And New York City, especially the bottom of the city, we were in a conflict zone in many ways, and occupied in many ways by our own military for safety and for other issues. And so that experience made me align myself in many ways with, and again, I talked about empathy before, but having a good understanding, I thought of, people who hadn't been to Beirut yet at that point. I'd been to Israel and Palestine in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords. So I'd understood, what it was like to look at tourism and other projects as part of a peace process. We know it's a very different situation right now there, but this sparked for me as a travel journalist and also somebody who looked at LGBT issues, how could I look at conflict zones in a way that others were not? And so not on the front lines, but to look at the impact of war on culture, on travel, human rights issues, and really to also look at the business sector of tourism. So not just going to the beach, going to a pool, but how do you rebuild the infrastructure? How do you encourage people to come? what are the thoughts of people who come to such locations and why? What is their curiosity? But also, what is the experience of people like who are welcoming those people? And tourism is, depending on how you count it, the second or the largest industry in all of the world. It sort of is on a par with petroleum. Everybody takes oil seriously, and it's that amount of money that it produces for the world. And so it is a significant way to rebuild places to be part of their resilience. I think resilience is one of the words we talked about in that I look at with my advisor at Purdue, Dr. Sandra Sidnor. So how do places recover, become resilient? Who are the people that are visiting those locations? And what is the experience for those who welcome them to those locations as they work to rebuild them? And I've been to Iraq. I've not yet been to Rwanda. I've been to Ukraine, but this was a number of years ago. And I'll be more actively looking at those two locations as well. Iraq, about 3 times I've been to, for Bloomberg, for the New York Times, for Gay City News, for other publications. So that is where it all comes from and what I'm doing, and now doing it at dissertation level. It was very hard to think about individual articles, but how do I look more holistically at these issues? And so that's why I do what I do.
Fantastic. It's so interesting to me because it's something I never thought about. And I love learning new things. I didn't know tourism was the number 2 industry behind petrol. That's like amazing to me. Yeah. And Rwanda, just I'm thinking of putting you two together. I had a guest, Frederick, whose arms were chopped off in the Rwandan genocide. And he has now a facility in Rwanda for all those who were dismembered in that genocide. So he'd be an interesting person for you to talk to, for sure. Definitely. So that's so cool. So you went from like travel tourism, sauna layout, tropical paradise to what is it possible? So I'll ask you that big question. Is it possible to regain or recover from war, calamity, natural? I don't know if you look at natural, certainly the water,
hurricanes, and
thank you, hurricane, the Philippines, right? And then the Hawaii. I haven't heard anything about that huge
Maui,
in Maui. I haven't even heard anything like post aftermath. So I would love for you to speak to all those things. If you've just tuned in, this is Dr. Marissa, and this is a show about hope and happiness. Take my advice, I'm not using it. Get balanced with Dr. Marissa, the morning show here on KCAA, AM 1050, FM 106.5. NBC News Radio, home to the Asian Oprah. Don't go away. We'll be right back for some station ID and more from Michael Luongo, my special guest today, healing from trauma countrywise. We'll be right back.
Take back your life with Dr. Marissa Pay.
And we're back. You're tuned in to Take My Advice. I'm not using it. Get balanced with Dr. Marissa, the morning show here on NBC News Radio, KCAA, the station that leaves no listener behind. And my very special guest this morning is Michael Luongo, who has had extensive experience as a journalist, travel journalist, going around and having several momentous milestone type experiences. One helping with the cleanup after Ground Zero, as well as visiting war-torn countries like Iran to look at tourism, which I didn't know was the number 2 income or country. How did you call it? The
So
number
it's number
two.
two. So there's a debate about whether tourism is number one or petroleum is number one, but they're roughly on a par with each other. And so depending on the statistic that you calculate. And I think that people sometimes think of tourism as a very frivolous industry. I think after COVID, we understood how important it was, both for our mental health, for the economies of the world, for connecting people. But in general, people take it as a frivolous industry, but nobody thinks of oil as a frivolous industry. So, you may hate it, you may not like, there's a lot of things to be said about the oil industry, but everyone takes it seriously. And I think tourism needs to be taken as seriously in terms of its impact on economies. I do want to just backtrack a little bit. I have not yet been to Iran. It was Iraq that I had been to a few times.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've
been very close to the border, like 5 or 6 feet from the border of Iran, both from the Afghanistan side and the Iraqi side, but I've not yet been. It is a goal of mine to visit Iran, a strong goal of mine to visit Iran, but I've not been there yet. So I think, one of the things you talked about before we went in, and also I love that when you do your segues, you mention the name of your guest again. Sometimes, should I point out that I'll be listening to NPR for a half hour and they never mention the name, like, who am I listening? Who are they interviewing? And so I love that. I just want to comment about that's really important in radio because you're listening. And I know some people are watching on YouTube right now too. So resilience, and I think this idea of rebuilding, you mentioned hurricanes, you mentioned tsunamis, you mentioned earthquakes, you mentioned Maui. I was at a conference in Montreal, ICRE, which is an academic tourism conference. There were a few people from Maui, university professors from Maui that I spoke with about this rebuilding process and where academia fits in it. I think one thing that's very different about hurricanes, earthquakes, fire, is while it destroys the infrastructure of a location, you still want to go there. And maybe you have to wait a year, 2 years. And yes, it's very destructive. It's deadly. I never want to understate that at all. But you still want to go back to that place and you want it to rebuild. A war zone is different. And a place may have had decades of degradation of its infrastructure. More importantly, it has a perception issue that the danger still remains long after the danger is gone. And I think one of the things that I was finding both with my journalism and now with my research is that it can take up to a generation for a place to rebuild its tourism industry. So if we're looking at Rwanda, if we're looking at Bosnia, this is 25 to 30 years after a war for it to begin to rebuild its tourism industry. So how do you jumpstart that? How do you make that happen more quickly? How do you reconnect an economy and people? Because tourism is about people connecting to more quickly and rebuild that sector. And hopefully that sector will promote peace, stability, democracy. I want to add that as well, as a strong proponent of democracy. But these are things that are important. And how do you find out about the tourists that are going there and why, and the people that are welcoming them in order to have this happen more quickly? And places can recover. I think what's really interesting is while you may want to go to Europe and look at war and World War II in particular, I think it's not at all the primary reason many people go. At my age, I'm 56. When I was a kid, this idea 30 years after the war, and again around Holocaust survivors, my father was a World War II veteran. The war was very much alive. I think that if we go back and look at Vietnam and that war ending for Americans roughly 50 years ago, that now young people go for the beaches in Vietnam and they don't really think about the war. But when it started to rebuild its tourism in the late 90s, you had a lot of veterans that were going back and their families were coming with them. And so it was still war related, and again, about a generation before that tourism began to build. And people really don't even think of Vietnam through the lens of the war. And I think that places like Gaza, Israel, Palestine have to think about how do you have, well, this is another thing I've looked at, how do you have pockets of tourism in the midst perhaps of an ongoing conflict that has not ended, maybe 75, 80 years old? Kashmir in India, again, a conflict that is as old as that. And so these are other ways of looking at this. No location, while I look at various locations, the lessons from each one can help, but each destination, each country, each region is quite distinct in how it recovers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. And I'm going to put the moose on the table, which is my Canadian version of talking about an elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So when I mentioned Iran instead of Iraq, and you're mentioning, Ukraine, when Russia went to war on Ukraine, I took Russia off of my bathtub list, which is bigger than a bucket list. I had a desire to go see the beautiful architecture, and because they violated Ukraine, I'm like, that's it. I'm not going. Tourist, right? Tourism. I'm not saying that everybody's going to do that, but I want to talk about, like you said, there's a huge distinction between war locations and natural disaster places where you want to go. Look at just even in the Olympics. I love the Olympics because it transcends that conflict. But I do know there was some tension, right? Russian Federation, Palestine, Israel. You don't naturally say, I want to go visit those countries, obviously, especially if they are the perpetrator, especially if they are, the ones that are invading. They're the bullies, so to speak. But it's taking that 80,000 foot look. The people are not the ones making the decisions that you're now punishing them for. So thank you for that distinction. Yeah,
and I would comment that, it's fascinating that when the United States invaded Iraq, there were calls. I am not in favor of boycotting visiting countries at all. I think that you need to visit a country and see it for yourself, to talk to the people. Part of that, of course, is I'm a journalist, so I go to places that others might not. But I think, and that you're getting to that point, I think even as a child, when we talked, before the end of the Cold War, of course, we're in a new Cold War, that this idea that it was people to people would be very different from government to government. And that's, whether you're visiting Cuba, whether you're visiting the United States, which is the world power, invades a lot of places. We can't say that we're any better always than other locations. And I think that the idea of boycotting visiting to the United States, you would not be able to talk to a lot of people who maybe opposed the Iraq War, who opposed a variety of things, who opposed the Vietnam War. So I think every major power goes through this, wish that it was not that way. But I think people really need to see a location for themselves. And I think even those who say, I won't go to Israel, I won't go to Palestine, I won't go to Palestine itself is extremely difficult to get to because you have to go through Israel itself. But I think if you go, you see the issues, you see the divisions among people, you see where people meet each other, though, despite divisions. And I think that this is really, really important. There are people who won't go to countries because of women's rights issues, for example. I think that's a very good comparison, or LGBT rights issues. But I think that you need to go and speak to people and their experiences that are very different from yours, and talk to them directly rather than saying, I won't go there because of the way that they treat women, or the way they treat LGBTs, or the way they treat Christians or Muslims or Jews. Or go and see as much as you can for yourself, and form your own opinions. And that's the beauty of travel, that you see things through other people and your experiences with other people.
That's a great point. If you've just tuned in and wondering what's going on in my studio today, This is Take My Advice. I'm not using it. Get Balanced with Dr. Marissa, the morning show on KCAA, AM 1050, FM 106.5, and streaming everywhere. iHeartRadio, Spotify, and of course, my YouTube TV channel that houses all 1,206 shows as of today, as well as Red Carpet playlist with my interviews with Halle Berry, John Travolta, Quincy Jones, and more. And today is Monday, Mental Health Monday Matters. So we're talking a different perspective, not your own mental health per se, but country mental health and recovering from war-torn areas. Is it possible to learn something about the country, about them, without punishing the country themselves? And my very special guest is Michael Luongo, who I met on my birthday online. And he's also going to be a teacher. Well, he is now a teacher. He's been teaching at UCLA for some number of years. And it's me that used to teach in the MBA school at UCLA, who's coming back to teach a specialty course. So we're going to be right back for a little station ID. We're going to do the news, and I'm going to play a little bit from our sponsor today, which is me, because I really wanted to have Michael on and to see what interesting things he had to say about healing.
Thank you.
Well, she has been dubbed the Asian Oprah, and she just wants all of us to be happy.
Dr. Marissa, aka the Asian Oprah, says the most important thing you can choose is choosing to be happy.
You are tuned into my weekly talk radio TV show called Take My Advice. I'm not using it. Get Balanced with Dr. Marissa.
That's the idea for Dr. Marissa Pay's new book called 8 Ways to Be Happy.
Many of us say, I am my own worst critic. Nobody's harder on me than I am. And my response to that is, stop it. Why are you doing that to yourself? You have to be your biggest fan, because if you can't at the end of the day say, I did a good job, who is? We don't have to constantly be angry at the things that are wrong. Why don't we choose to be happy about things that are right? We have the choice. That's our muscle. And life is so amazing if we can see it.
Take back your life with Dr. Marissa Pay.
And welcome back. It is Take My Advice. I'm not using it. Get Balanced with Dr. Marissa, the morning show. And for Mental Health Matters Mondays, I have a very special guest, Michael Luongo, who is, those of you who missed his formal introduction, he is a very experienced journalist. And it's not coming up here for me to read. Oh, wait. He's an award-winning journalist, TEDx speaker, and academic who's the author and editor of 16 books, mostly focused on travel, LGBTQ issues, and a novel. He's a PhD student and instructor at Purdue University, where he researches tourism redevelopment in the context of conflict, focusing on Iraq, Rwanda, and Ukraine. And he also teaches writing online for UCLA. He's been to over 100 countries and all 7 continents, including for his freelance reporting in the New York Times, Bloomberg News, CNN, Gay City News, and other publications. Please welcome back to my studio here, Michael Luongo. You can tell I'm a big affirmer.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for all of that. There's an anecdote that I love to give about sort of why travel. And we talked about Shanghai. We bonded over Shanghai. Your family traces its roots through Shanghai. And, we talked about both of us teaching in Shanghai, for example. And one thing that I point out to people about travel and how it can break down, create understanding and sort of break down barriers was a visit to the Communist Museum in Shanghai. Now, I'm American, raised anti-communist. We thought of communism as evil. But when you go to the museum and you understand the development of communism and why it took hold in places like Russia, places like China, what struck me most were a pair of pants in that museum. And that pair of pants explained to me everything I needed to know about why hundreds of millions of people, I'm not sure the population in, exactly at that time, but why so many people supported communism as a government and saw it as hope. And it was this pair of pants that was patched and patched and patched and patched and patched again and again, like something you might see from The Good Earth, Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, if it wasn't Hollywoodized and glamorized in some ways. And seeing that and the story of the quote unquote peasant farmer that those pants came from, suddenly it all made sense. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is poverty that I cannot imagine, that whether that the emperor could not get people out of, and in fact exacerbated, that the various revolutions, and I think many of us and many of my students even there were like, between the collapse of the empire and the coming of communism in the late 1940s, we don't really know that much about that. They're not taught that much. And I think even as Americans, we're not taught that much unless you watch, Amy Tan's
Joy Luck Club.
Good Luck, Joy Luck Club, which kind of explains some of that. And that experience of saying, okay, I'm going to go to a museum about an ideology that I've been raised to hate, and understand why people wanted it and what it meant for people. I think that's the experience of travel, and maybe better understanding my students and their perspective. And that's why you go and you expose yourself to things that are very different from what you have grown up thinking about. And that is one of those very pointed examples that I like to give when I tell people about the power of travel and how transformative it can be and what it exposes you to learn about. I would not want to be communist, but I understand why it took hold because of this display case and the story behind that pair of pants.
Powerful. And I wish that more people, especially Americans, who seem to, I don't know if I'm sure you looked at Hofstede's studies looking at how countries differ on different, two academics talking to each other, on scales of independence or independent thought or systems thinking or Newtonian thinking. And I actually mentioned this, I think last Monday, is that as Americans, we've taken all the good of allowing differences, which was our whole premise of this country. And it's going in a direction, if you're in any one of the camps, that is trying to, that whole Make America Great Again is actually going backwards into the place of not valuing diversity, which is hurting, that I can't even imagine the desire to go to a country that you did talk about just now that was so against ideology. And I hear so much about, socialism, blah, 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 and communism. And it's like in the short film that I put together, PPP, Post-Pandemic Possibilities, it's can we talk about helping, like the balance between making money and, opportunity and all of that, balancing that out with, recognizing we're not on equal ground when you're trying to do something. And it's hard. It's hard for people and cultures who are so, is it right, wrong, good, bad? What category does it go into? You can't be open to what you just said. Can we go travel to explore and discover differences? The answer would be no. For many, right? American, and I'm a proud American. I chose to be American. I gave up my Canadian citizenship right after 9/11, which is what caught me in your TEDx. So sorry, I had to just say that because I'm hoping we can change.
Yeah. I think travel does help with change. I mean, clearly you can go to, in New York, I live in Washington Heights, which is a largely Dominican neighborhood, at least my section of the neighborhood. A lot of people vacation in the Dominican Republic, and they could say they've gone to the Dominican Republic, but they're in a resort, a closed off, walled off place, and maybe they don't interact with locals. So I think you can definitely go to places and not really interact with locals and not learn about the culture. This is one of the issues of over tourism, which is another topic to get into. But I think you still need to be that type of person who wants to interact with people who are different. And you don't have to go to another country to do that. You live in LA, I live in New York. We're constantly surrounded by people who are different from ourselves, speaking a variety of languages. I'm Italian on my father's side. I'm actually a dual citizen. And so, this constant notion of being exposed to different other languages. And I think, you can find that in the United States. You can go to Idaho, a flyover country, quote unquote, location. I've not been to Idaho. I almost taught in Idaho, and experience Basque culture. The largest Basque population outside of Spain is in Idaho. I think that's correct. I know it's large. I think it is the largest. So these are examples. Somalian culture, you can go to Minnesota and experience Somalian culture. So you don't even have to leave the United States and this is part of what makes America great. And not even, again, it just makes it great because it is so diverse and there are so many different kinds of people. And that's, you can travel within, there's about 5 or 6 states I still have to get to. And I do plan to, and experience that unique part of, and even in Indiana, there's a lot of, I have students who grew up in farm communities. I grew up in New Jersey, in the suburbs of New York. I'm from Freehold, Bruce Springsteen's town. And, it's a small town, but part of the big metropolitan region. But to grow up in a tiny farm town and have one of my students from there, and she's telling me, this is a true story, she purposely wanted to pick tourism. This is one of my Purdue students, because she could see the world and sort of expand and everything. And for me to visit one of those small towns is an experience in itself because it's so different from my own experience.
Yeah. I do want you to touch upon the main topic.
Yeah. Resilience or rebuilding or like.
Yes.
Lead me through the question.
No, I know. But I purposely, I just love getting to know people. I don't do pre-interviews for this purpose, but I did hint that we were going to talk about what it is like to travel in a country that's had war. And you also did talk about that in your TEDx. So can you just give us a couple of that?
Sure. I think the first time I had done that would have been 1996, visiting Israel and Palestine a few years after the Oslo Accords were signed. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of building in Palestine in particular, in the West Bank. We did go through Gaza technically at that point because we went through there to go to Egypt through the Rafah crossing. So I think the interactions with both Israelis, Palestinians, and a variety of different people were curiosity about what was next. This idea that this will be hopeful. We know that a lot of that hope, unfortunately, was shattered and continues to be shattered. So that's part of it, is this hope. Having gone, let's say, very directly a place like Afghanistan, which I've been to 3 times and done extensive writing on, that's a place where, of course, you're going to be afraid to go. But it's one of those places where I received such an incredible welcome. I wrote a New York Times piece, a business travel piece about, and you were supposed to, at the time, it was an article called On the Ground, that they no longer do in their itineraries, the travel section that's in the business section, not the actual travel section. And you have to put a little anecdote at the end. And I put this idea of people saying chai, or tea, offering you tea everywhere you went. Because you were foreign, people were welcoming you into their spaces. And this was not something I expected at all. And so this ability to move, now 2003 was a very peaceful time in Kabul. So you have to preface it with that a bit. The other thing is, people know that you're a little bit afraid. People will look out for you in many ways. I think that was especially my experience my first time visiting Iraq, Baghdad in particular, in 2007, how very worried locals were for me. Now, these are people who put their lives on the line for me to interview them, whether I'm at a hotel, which unfortunately no longer exists, the Al-Hamra, which was blown up and destroyed, hotel where people came for interviews, or they came into the green zone. People put their lives on the line because they wanted to tell their stories. So I think and such people also warned me about this, that, and the other thing, and where to go, where not to go, went out of their way to find ways to protect me. And so people are very happy that you're coming into their country. They're worried about you. And I think for the Middle East in particular, the idea of hospitality is so important. So that's one, a few examples that I can give you. And, other trips through Lebanon, for example, which is constantly in this sort of cycle of war, peace. I think what's fascinating about that country, and it's, Beirut in particular is called the Paris of the Middle East, this idea that we don't know what's going to happen in the future, so we're going to enjoy ourselves as much as we can. And tragedy touches all of us in different ways, but it's also a thing that levels us in many ways, or equalizes us. And so people know that they may, so people will go dancing in Beirut. I think that 2 cities that I've been to, Beirut and Tel Aviv, are very similar in many ways, because people know that they will experience war and deprivation, but they will still try to figure out ways to enjoy their lives as much as they can. These 2 cities that don't technically communicate with each other, countries that border each other and are at war, really in a constant state of war, are extremely similar places. And so this idea of visiting and seeing locations and they want to change perceptions. They want to welcome you. And some of the best experiences I've ever had. I remember saying this to an editor at the New York Times. We didn't wind up doing this piece, but it was meant to be opinion-y kind of piece, because I'd also been to Haiti and was surprised by the welcome right in the aftermath of September 11th that I got from completely impoverished people. The worst places are the best places to visit. And it's because people are so welcoming and they're so happy that you're visiting. And I think in the aftermath of September 11th, many of us were this way in New York. We were so happy that you came to visit in the aftermath. And so that, I think, is probably it in a nutshell. The worst places are sometimes the best places. Obviously, there are certain parts you shouldn't visit that are more dangerous, that are under direct shelling. Always listen to the locals about things. And remember, they put their lives at risk when they welcome you. But the worst places, or the seemingly worst places, are often the best places, because they are not jaded by your visit. They want to welcome you, and they're happy that you're there. Hopefully that kind of answers the question and that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, as you're speaking, yeah, I just got back from China. We talked about that, and I had so many people really worried about me being in China because of what happened, to the volley, to the I forgot her. I have great memory. I have horrible recall. But the one that was, jailed in China, and then the news, like the media, there's no such thing as unbiased media. Everybody has an opinion, and that's what they're but all the stories, when you say bad areas, a lot of them aren't bad areas, but they're put in the media. You don't hear about the 99 positive experiences tourists had in Mexico, or where you hear about that one horrific thing that happened, which then it's too dangerous to go visit such and such a place. Like, I was stunned at how the disparity between the fear people had for me going into China versus what my experience was, which was completely, VIP, blah, blah, blah. So I think that to recognize, the truth about a place requires you to do a little exploration, to do a little research yourself, and don't believe everything that you're hearing, or MS, meaningless scrolling, right? So I'm going to have you, as usual, time went very fast.
Oh, yeah, very quickly. Thank you.
But if you could give us, as a final word, what you would say are your top destinations that maybe aren't on people's lists that you would recommend, as we take a stand for valuing diversity, where would you challenge people to go to visit for their trip this year?
So I often tell people that one of the most fascinating places I've ever been to is Afghanistan. This is going to be very controversial in some ways. And so I'm doing a lot of work on Iraq for my dissertation research. Many of those visitors who were interviewing about Iraq, they're very well traveled, 100 plus countries. And they're also adding Afghanistan, including women, to their experiences. Now, right now, this is a very terrible thing to perhaps state. The repression has made it safer to visit, and I wish that the repression was not there. So what I'm hearing, now I've not been to Afghanistan myself in a number of years, is that despite the repression, it's become safe to visit. I wish that I didn't have to explain it in that way. And so the people that I've been interviewing for Iraq, about half of them have been to Afghanistan very recently, since the Taliban took over. I wish the Taliban had not taken over. I wish that things were very different. So it's really interesting hearing that from people. Take that with a grain of salt. But I will say that Afghanistan, when I visited, the 3 times that I visited, it remains under your skin in a way that no other place remains, despite all of its problems. And there are certain places you can go to that are relatively safe, and there are companies that can bring you there, for example. I will state, and I don't want it to become over tourism, the remote beaches of Argentina and Uruguay. I lived in Argentina writing the Frommer's Buenos Aires and Argentina guidebooks, and some of the very remote beaches in like Punta del Diablo, Rocha, all of these beaches beyond Punta del Este in Uruguay, and I wrote about them for Bloomberg News. They have no electricity, they're just incredible to go visit. And some of these other beaches, Piña del Mar, Mar del Plata, all of these in Buenos Aires province, and Bahia Blanca is another as you go further down. So there really are fewer people, foreigners, who go to them. Punta del Este had its moment, its international moment, but you really want to push out far from there. So those are places that I'd recommend. I went to the Falkland Islands, also called Islas Malvinas. I have to say that, and again, this is about war and tourism, because if you're old enough, you remember it through the lens of the 1982 war. it was one of the most fascinating places I have ever been to. And I actually applied to work there, didn't get a position there, but you've got about 2,500, 3,000 people. It's so remote, so fascinating. So that's another place that I highly recommend. I think in terms of war recovery, we've talked about China, going to Nanjing to kind of look at this is a bit of dark tourism. I do not research dark tourism specifically. I want to make that clear in looking
What
at
is that?
So tourism is dark tourism or thanatourism or death tourism. It's a component of looking at war and recovery. Perhaps the most famous place in the world that is an example of dark tourism is Auschwitz. Ground Zero is another example of dark tourism, but we want to look at those within components of an entire ecosystem of how a place recovers from war and from tragedy. So there are components that the museum in Nanjing, did you get to Nanjing?
Not this trip. I was there in 2009.
So it's a museum that is created in a way that we would never do a museum where the bodies of people are sort of the mass grave is dug up and you look down directly at the mass grave. But I think talking with people, one of my students was from Nanjing when I taught in Shanghai, was really fascinating. I'm going to blank on there's a researcher that has a monument. She's an American, an ABC. I want to who had done a lot of research on women in Nanjing, and I'm going to blank on her name. Ultimately, I believe it was she committed suicide because of the stories that she was getting out of people. It was so tragic. So,
and I hate to cut you off, but we are totally out of time.
Yeah, that's a bad. I think go to places that are different. Talk to people. And even go to places that have dark history to really learn how people have recovered and been resilient. And really thank you, Dr. Marissa, for having me on. I so enjoyed this whole conversation and meeting you on your birthday through our UCLA training. It was a gift to me on your birthday. So,
thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This is Michael Luongo. And it's all about balance. This is how I sign out of every show. So if you could join me in this, it's all about balance. Peace in, peace out. World peace through, inner peace. Don't go away too long. Tomorrow, I have another journalist coming on, Dan Luzador, who is going to give us a critical, you might want to come and see what's going on. He's going to give a critique on 2 controversial books, The Manchurian Journalist and Street Talk. So he is another, I didn't realize we're going to have 2 journalists in a row until just now. But thank you for tuning in so much. Now go and have the best day ever. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks again, Dan.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you.
Absolutely.